She stood in the middle of the crowded cafe, her voice dripping with disdain. "Why don't you just go back to Africa where you belong?" she sneered, glaring at the black man seated across the room. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks clinked against plates, and an uneasy silence fell over the space. But instead of anger, the man smiled, a calm, knowing smile that sent a ripple of curiosity through the stunned crowd. He rose slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a piercing intensity. What he said next didn't just silence her. It left everyone in the room questioning everything they thought they knew. Before we jump into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you love powerful stories of justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so you never miss what's coming next. Now, let's get started. From the moment Elijah walked into the cafe, there was an air about him that made people take notice. Not because he was loud or imposing, but because of the quiet confidence he carried. Tall, with deep brown eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories, Elijah was the kind of man who didn't need to demand respect. It simply followed him. Yet, for reasons only they could understand, some people chose to overlook him, to underestimate him. Today was no different. Dressed in a simple suit, Elijah took his usual corner seat, a worn, leather-bound journal in hand. He scribbled notes, his pen moving methodically across the pages as if weaving something important. He wasn't just a man sitting quietly, he was a man waiting. For what? No one knew, but they would soon find out. And when they did, the world inside that cafe would never feel the same. It started with a cough, a deliberate, exaggerated sound from the table next to Elijah. The woman, sitting there, middle-aged and sharply dressed, tapped her manicured nails against her coffee cup, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him. "Excuse me," she said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby patrons. "I don't think people like you understand how things work around here." Elijah paused mid-scribble, slowly looking up, his calm gaze meeting her glare. The room grew tense, conversations dwindling to hushed whispers. "People like me?" he asked, his voice steady but pointed. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with a smirk. "Oh, you know exactly what I mean. Coming here, acting like you belong. Maybe you should take that notebook and those ideas of yours back to Africa." Her words were sharp, cruel, and purposeful, cutting through the cafe like a blade. A wave of discomfort swept through the room, but no one spoke up. Eyes darted between Elijah and the woman, waiting to see what would happen next. Elijah, however, didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his journal, placed his pen down carefully, and stood. The silence was deafening, but the storm brewing behind his eyes was impossible to ignore. What came next would be something no one in that room could forget. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Instead, he began with a question. "Do you know what's written in this journal?" he asked, holding it up for the woman and the entire cafe to see. His calm demeanor only added weight to his words, drawing the attention of everyone around. The woman scoffed, rolling her eyes. "I don't care what's in your little book. Probably some nonsense trying to play the victim." Elijah chuckled softly, a sound that seemed oddly out of place given the tension. "Actually, it's the blueprint for a project I'm working on," he said, his tone measured and deliberate. "One that's already created jobs for hundreds of people across this city, people from all walks of life. But you're right, I didn't write it for people like you." The room seemed to hold its breath as his words hung in the air. Elijah's presence was no longer quiet. It was commanding, and every eye was fixed on him. "You see, I've spent my life building opportunities where none existed, turning neglect into growth, discrimination into empowerment. That's what's in this little book." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering but somehow growing more powerful. "And maybe you should be asking yourself why someone like me can do all that, while someone like you sits here tearing people down." The cafe was utterly silent. the weight of his words pressing on everyone present. But Elijah wasn't finished. What he was about to reveal would shake the very foundation of the room. Elijah's words lingered in the air, but the woman wasn't ready to back down. She let out a bitter laugh, her voice laced with mockery. "Jobs? Projects? Oh, please, anyone can talk big. Show me proof, Mr. Savior." Elijah tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Proof?" he repeated, as if the question amused him. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black phone. "All right, let's see if proof will help open some eyes today." With a few taps, he pulled up a video and turned the screen toward the crowd. The clip showed a bustling warehouse filled with workers, machinery, and rows of products stamped with a logo that matched the one subtly embossed on his journal. "This is one of 5 distribution centers my team and I have built," Elijah explained. "And the man running it now? He's someone society once gave up on, just like many of the others working there." The murmurs in the cafe grew louder as people leaned in, craning their necks to catch a glimpse. But Elijah wasn't finished. "If that's not enough, let me show you the community center we rebuilt last year," he continued, scrolling to another image. "It's where dozens of kids who look like me, now have a chance to learn, grow, and dream, beyond the limits people like you try to set for them." The woman's smirk faltered, but her pride wouldn't let her admit defeat. "Anyone can post pictures," she muttered, her voice quieter now. "Doesn't mean it's real." Elijah raised an eyebrow, unshaken. "Oh, it's real. You could even ask the mayor." He turned to the crowd, addressing them directly. "In fact, some of you might have benefited from it without realizing it. But if you still doubt me, I'm happy to explain why I do what I do, and who inspired me to start." The crowd was riveted, hanging on his every word. Whatever was coming next, they knew it was going to be unforgettable. Elijah's eyes swept over the room, landing back on the woman. "You see," he began, his voice calm but charged with emotion, "my story didn't start with success. It started with a boy who was told every single day that he didn't belong." The crowd leaned in, the weight of his words pulling them closer. "I grew up hearing those same words you just said to me today. Go back to Africa." They weren't just words. They were knives, meant to cut me down, to make me feel small. He paused, his voice tightening with the memory. And for a long time, they did. He took a step forward, holding up the journal. "But instead of letting those words define me, I started writing. Every insult, every rejection, it went in here. But not as anger, as fuel, as a plan." The room was silent, every eye fixed on him as he continued. "I worked my way through college, often being the only black student in my classes, constantly underestimated. But instead of breaking, I built. I built relationships, I built knowledge, and eventually I built businesses. Businesses that now employ hundreds of people, regardless of what they look like." Elijah's gaze locked on the woman, his voice firm yet steady. "And here's the part you really need to hear. The very cafe you're sitting in, sipping your coffee, it's part of the property portfolio my company owns. So the next time you tell someone they don't belong, remember this. You're sitting in a space that exists because someone like me refused to leave." Gasps rippled through the crowd as realization dawned on them. The woman's face flushed, her bravado crumbling under the weight of the truth. But Elijah wasn't looking for applause. His focus was on delivering a message that no one in the room would forget. The woman sat frozen, her confidence shattered as the crowd began to murmur in astonishment. Elijah, however, didn't gloat or revel in her discomfort. Instead, he turned his attention back to the room, his tone softening but retaining its weight. "You see," he said, "this isn't about humiliating anyone. It's about opening eyes. We're so quick to judge, to dismiss, to tear each other down, that we miss the bigger picture. We all have struggles, we all have stories, but none of us get better by building walls between one another." He glanced at the woman once more, his expression calm yet resolute. "You asked me to go back to Africa, but what you don't realize is that my heritage, my roots, are not something to run from. They're my strength. They taught me resilience, taught me to rise even when the odds were stacked against me. And if you took a moment to look beyond your bias, you'd see the same potential in others around you." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. People exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from judgment to introspection. Elijah gathered his journal, preparing to leave. As he turned toward the door, he paused and looked back. "The truth is, I don't need to prove anything to anyone. But I hope today taught you something. Underestimating someone based on their skin or their story doesn't define them. It defines you. And if we're going to build a better world, it starts with breaking down those barriers, one person at a time." With that, he walked out, leaving the cafe in a state of quiet reflection. The woman sat speechless, her earlier arrogance replaced by something she hadn't felt in years: shame. For the rest of the day, the cafe hummed with conversation, not about Elijah's race, but about his strength, his integrity, and the uncomfortable truths he had laid bare. The morale of the story was clear. Greatness isn't confined to a race, a background, or a single story. It's born from resilience, fueled by determination, and made undeniable by actions that inspire others to see beyond their prejudices.